Seven-time Formula One. World champion Lewis Hamilton never expected to find George Wallace still mopping floors. During a nostalgic visit to his old school in Stevenage, Lewis is shocked to discover his former janitor, the man who once believed in his racing dreams when few others did, still working at age 80, struggling with arthritis and pain to support his family after a tragedy. What begins as a chance reunion quickly transforms into something neither man could have imagined. Lewis Hamilton, at the height of his career and wealth, suddenly remembers a forgotten childhood promise. His response to finding his elderly mentor still working will leave both the racing world and Mr. Wallace's family speechless. Lewis Hamilton tapped his fingers on the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes. The familiar streets of Stevenage looked both the same and different at once. New shops had replaced old ones. Fresh paint covered once faded buildings. But the feeling? That was exactly the same. "Take the next right," Lewis told his driver. He could have driven himself, but his team worried about fans spotting him. At 40 years old, with 7 Formula One World Championships to his name, Lewis Hamilton couldn't just drive around his hometown without causing a stir. Lewis pulled his cap lower as the car rolled past the neighborhood where he grew up. The modest houses looked smaller than he remembered. He thought about his dad Anthony working multiple jobs to fund his racing dreams, about the sacrifices his family made, about the path that led from these streets to racing circuits around the world. "We're approaching the school, sir," the driver said. The John Henry Newman Catholic School came into view. Lewis felt a flutter in his stomach, like the one he still got before races, even after all these years. He hadn't planned to visit during this summer break. Monaco, Miami, or Malibu would have made more sense. But something had pulled him back to Stevenage, back to where it all began. "I'll only be an hour or so," Lewis told the driver as they pulled up to the school entrance. "Keep the engine running if anyone starts taking pictures." The school looked different. New buildings stood where empty fields used to be. The sports facilities had been upgraded, partly thanks to donations Lewis had made over the years. He'd sent money but hadn't visited in person since he became famous. The thought made him frown slightly. Mr. Hamilton. Such an honor. The headmaster hurried down the steps to greet him. They had arranged this private tour weeks ago with strict instructions. No press, no photos, no announcements to students who were away on summer holiday anyway. "The honor is mine," Lewis replied with his practiced smile. "It's been too long." They walked through the main entrance. The smell hit Lewis immediately. Floor polish and school lunches. Some things never changed. The hallways seemed narrower, the ceilings lower. Wasn't that always the way when you returned to childhood places as an adult? "We've kept your old trophies in our display case," the headmaster said proudly, leading Lewis to a glass cabinet near the front office. There they were, small karting trophies he'd won as a boy. They looked tiny compared to his Formula One championship. Trophies, but they meant just as much, maybe more. These represented the beginning, when racing was pure joy, before it became his job. "And here's our wall of fame," the headmaster continued, pointing to a large display with photos of successful alumni. Lewis's picture was biggest, of course, alongside newspaper headlines about his championships. But as they moved through the halls, other memories surfaced. Not all of them good. This was where Marcus Jenkins had shoved him into a locker for being different. There was the classroom where Mrs. Benson had made him read aloud, exposing his dyslexia to classmates who already thought the black kid who wanted to be a race car driver was aiming too high. Lewis pushed those thoughts away. He'd proven them. All wrong, hadn't he? "Could we see the old karting club room?" Lewis asked suddenly. The headmaster looked surprised. Of course, it's now our STEM lab. But certainly. They turned down a corridor Lewis remembered well. How many times had he raced down this hallway after school, eager to talk racing with the few teachers who encouraged his dream? The karting club, room 133, had new signs on the door. Science and Engineering Lab. Inside, sleek computers and 3D printers had replaced the old tables where Lewis and his friends used to pore over racing magazines. We use this space to teach students about aerodynamics, engineering, computer modeling, all things useful in motorsport, actually, the headmaster explained. Your success inspired a whole generation of students to, but Lewis wasn't listening anymore. His attention had fixed on something, no, someone, at the back of the room. An elderly man was slowly mopping the floor, his movements careful but practiced. Something about the way he moved seemed familiar. The old man looked up, perhaps feeling Lewis's gaze. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with Wallace stitched above the pocket. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Lewis felt his heart stop. Mr. Wallace, the school janitor from when Lewis was a student, the man who used to let Lewis eat lunch in his maintenance office when bullies were looking for him, the man who had once been a mechanic and taught Lewis about engines when everyone else thought he was just a dreamer. And here he was, still mopping the same floors. His hair was completely white now, his back more stooped, but those kind eyes were unmistakable. Mr. Wallace? Lewis's voice came out barely above a whisper. The old man squinted, then his eyes widened in recognition. Lewis Hamilton? Is that really you? The mop clattered to the floor as Lewis crossed the room in 4 quick strides. Before he knew what he was doing, Lewis had wrapped the older man in a hug. Mr. Wallace smelled exactly the same. Like lemon, floor cleaner, and mint gum. You remember me, Lewis said, stepping back but keeping his hands on the older man's shoulders. Mr. Wallace chuckled. Remember you? The skinny kid who wouldn't stop talking about becoming a Formula One driver? Who could? Forget? Lewis glanced at the headmaster, who looked confused by this emotional reunion with the school janitor. Mr. Wallace was here when I was a student, Lewis explained. Lewis paused, unsure how to explain that this man had been one of the few adults at school who had truly believed in him. I just kept the floors clean, Mr. Wallace said modestly. You did a lot more than that, Lewis insisted. Then, with sudden concern, but you must be 80 last month, Mr. Wallace confirmed, almost proudly. Still going strong. But why? Are you still working? Lewis couldn't hide his shock. A shadow passed over the old man's face. Got to keep busy, don't I? Besides, these floors won't clean themselves. The headmaster cleared his throat. Mr. Wallace has been with the school for nearly 40 years, an institution himself. Lewis couldn't take his eyes off the janitor. 40 years of mopping these floors, watching other people's children grow up and chase their dreams, including him. We should let you finish your work, the headmaster said to Mr. Wallace. No, Lewis said firmly. Actually, I'd like to talk with Mr. Wallace. Could we use your office, just for a few minutes? The surprise on both men's faces was almost comical. But Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, global celebrity, and the school's most famous alumnus, was not someone the headmaster could refuse. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. I can finish mopping later, Mr. Wallace said, placing his mop in the bucket. His hands trembled slightly. From age or excitement, Lewis couldn't tell. The headmaster led them to his office, a room Lewis had only visited once as a student, when he'd been caught racing his bicycle too fast around the school yard. Now he was invited in like a celebrity guest. Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee? The headmaster asked, hovering by the door. Just some privacy, please, Lewis said with a polite smile that made it clear this wasn't a request. When the door closed, Lewis turned to Mr. Wallace, who stood awkwardly in his gray maintenance uniform, looking out of place among the polished furniture. Please sit down, Lewis said, pointing to the comfortable chair across from him. I'll get the chair dirty. Mr. Wallace hesitated. Sit, Lewis insisted gently. It's fine. Mr. Wallace lowered himself carefully into the chair, his joints cracking. Up close, Lewis could see how time had marked the old man. Deep wrinkles lined his face. His hands were spotted and knotted with arthritis. But his eyes, those were the same kind eyes that had watched a young Lewis talk endlessly about becoming a racing driver. I can't believe it's really you, Mr. Wallace said, shaking his head in wonder. I watch all your races on TV. I even stayed up until 2 a.m. to watch that Japan Grand Prix last year. You follow my career? Lewis asked, surprised and touched. Follow it? I've got scrapbooks full of newspaper clippings about you. When you won your first championship, I bought champagne, drank it all myself. Mr. Wallace laughed, then added, more seriously, I always knew you'd make it. Lewis felt a lump forming in his throat. You were one of the few who did. Nonsense! Mr. Wallace waved his hand. Your father believed in you more than anyone. Dad had to believe in me. He was my father, Lewis smiled. But you had no reason to encourage some hyperactive kid with big dreams. Mr. Wallace's face softened. You weren't just some kid, Lewis. You had a fire in you. I recognized it because I've seen it before. In real racers. That's right, Lewis remembered suddenly. You worked as a mechanic before becoming a janitor, didn't you? For a small racing team in the 1960s, Mr. Wallace nodded. Nothing fancy like Formula One, just local stuff mostly. But I learned how engines speak, their language of purrs and whines. Lewis leaned forward. You taught me that. Remember when my cart's engine kept stalling? Dad and I worked on it for hours. Then you took one listen and knew exactly what was wrong. Loose valve, they both said simultaneously, then broke into laughter. You remember that? Mr. Wallace seemed genuinely surprised. I remember everything you taught me, Lewis said seriously. How to listen to the engine. How to feel the balance of the cart through my hands. That stuff wasn't in any racing book. It was pure experience. Mr. Wallace looked down at his worn hands. Just passing on what I knew. A comfortable silence fell between them. Lewis studied the old man. There was something he needed to ask, but he wasn't sure how. Mr. Wallace, he finally said, why are you still working? You must be well past retirement age. The janitor's smile faded slightly. Can't afford to stop, can I? The pension's not enough, especially now with... He stopped himself. With what? Lewis pressed gently. Mr. Wallace sighed. My son James passed away 5 years ago. Car accident. He was helping someone. A young mother and her baby were trapped in a burning car. He got them out, but couldn't save himself. James? Lewis tried to remember. Tall guy? Few years older than me? That's him. You probably wouldn't remember him much. He was already in upper school when you started. I'm so sorry, Lewis said, genuinely pained by the loss this kind man had suffered. His kids, my grandchildren, live with their mother now. She's a nurse, works all hours. I help out with money when I can. That's why I keep working. Lewis felt a cold weight in his stomach. While he had been traveling the world, winning championships, building a fortune worth hundreds of millions, this man who had been kind to him was mopping floors at age 80 to help support his grandchildren. Do you enjoy the work, at least? Lewis asked. Mr. Wallace smiled faintly. The work's all right. Kids are still kids, messy, noisy, full of life. Someone's got to clean up after them. Might as well be me. Lewis remembered something, a promise he'd made long ago. He had been about 15, just starting to win bigger karting competitions. He'd told Mr. Wallace that one day, when he became a famous racer, he'd make sure the old janitor could retire, comfortably. Had he really forgotten that promise? Or had he simply gotten so caught up in his own success that it slipped away? "When do you finish work today?" Lewis asked suddenly. Mr. Wallace looked at his old wristwatch. 4 o'clock, another 2 hours yet. "Can you get off early? I'd like to take you to dinner." The janitor's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Dinner? With you? I'm not dressed for—" "It's just food," Lewis interrupted with a smile. "Two old friends catching up. Nothing fancy." Mr. Wallace seemed to struggle with the idea. "I don't know. I've got the science wing to finish mopping." "I'm sure they can manage without you for one afternoon," Lewis insisted. Then, sensing the man's hesitation might be about something else, he added, "I won't take no for an answer, Mr. Wallace. You spent years listening to me talk about racing. Now it's my turn to listen to what you've been doing all this time." The old man's resistance crumbled under Lewis's gentle persistence. "Well, when you put it that way, but I need to tell the head custodian." "I'll handle it," Lewis said, standing up. "There's a restaurant I used to go to with my dad, Fratelli's. Do you know it? The Italian place on High Street. It's still there, but very expensive now." "Perfect. Meet me there at 6. And, Mr. Wallace—" Lewis paused at the door. "Yes? Bring those scrapbooks you mentioned. I'd love to see them." After making arrangements with the school administration for Mr. Wallace to leave early, which took exactly one autograph and a selfie with the head custodian, Lewis returned to his waiting car, mind racing faster than any Formula One vehicle. He made 3 phone calls on the way back to his hotel. One to his assistant to clear his schedule for the next few days, one to his financial advisor, and one to Toto Wolff, the boss of his Mercedes racing team. "Toto," Lewis said when the Austrian answered, "I need a favor. A big one." By the time Lewis arrived at Fratelli's that evening, wearing jeans and a simple black T-shirt to avoid attention, he had the beginnings of a plan. He spotted Mr. Wallace immediately, sitting nervously at a corner table, wearing what was clearly his best outfit, a slightly outdated suit that hung loosely on his thin frame. Next to him on the chair was a stack of 3 large worn scrapbooks. Lewis took a deep breath. He hadn't felt this kind of nervous energy since his first Formula One race. But this felt more important somehow. Lewis took a deep breath. He hadn't felt this kind of nervous energy since his first Formula One race. But this felt more important somehow. "Mr. Wallace," Lewis said, approaching the table with a warm smile. The old janitor tried to stand, but Lewis quickly motioned for him to stay seated. "Please, don't get up." "Lewis Hamilton," Mr. Wallace said, his voice filled with wonder. "Sitting down to dinner with me. The lads at the school won't believe it." "It's just Lewis," he insisted, sliding into the seat across from the older man. "And I'm the one who's honored." A waiter approached immediately, clearly recognizing Lewis despite his casual clothes. "Mr. Hamilton, what an honor. Would you prefer a private room?" Lewis glanced at Mr. Wallace, who already looked uncomfortable with the attention. "No, thank you. Just some privacy would be appreciated." The waiter nodded and discreetly signaled to the staff to keep other diners at a distance. After ordering drinks, sparkling water for Lewis, who never drank alcohol during racing season, and a small glass of red wine for Mr. Wallace, they settled into conversation. "So," Lewis gestured to the scrapbooks, "you really kept track of my career?" Mr. Wallace's weathered hands rested protectively on the top book. "Every race, every championship." He carefully opened the first scrapbook to reveal neatly arranged newspaper clippings, race programs, and printed photos. Lewis leaned forward, genuinely touched. The first pages showed him as a teenager in karting competitions. There were clippings from local newspapers that Lewis had never even seen. "This is amazing," Lewis murmured, turning the pages. "You saved all of this?" "I told everyone who would listen that I knew Lewis Hamilton before he was famous," Mr. Wallace said proudly. "Some of the teachers thought I was exaggerating about how good you'd be. I won a few bets over the years," Lewis laughed. "You bet on me?" "Only when I knew I'd win," Mr. Wallace winked, some of his nervousness fading. As they ate dinner, Lewis had the pasta, while Mr. Wallace chose the lasagna. His once-a-year treat. They went through the scrapbooks. Lewis was surprised to find photos he'd never seen before, including one that made him pause. "Where did you get this?" Lewis asked, pointing to a picture of himself at about 12 years old, standing proudly next to his cart. On either side of him stood his father, Anthony, and Mr. Wallace, all three smiling widely. "That was after the Buckmore Park Championship," Mr. Wallace said softly. "Your father took it. He sent me a copy." Lewis stared at the photo. He remembered that day clearly. It was his first major karting victory. What he hadn't remembered was that Mr. Wallace had been there, or that his father had thought to include the school janitor in their celebration. "The night before that race," Mr. Wallace continued, "your cart wasn't running right. Your dad brought it to the school because he knew I'd be working late. We fixed the fuel line together." More memories surfaced in Lewis's mind. His father, stressed about money and the cart problems. The relief when Mr. Wallace identified the issue. How the old mechanic had stayed 2 hours after his shift to help them. "I remember now," Lewis said quietly. "You refused to take any money from Dad." "Couldn't take money for helping a friend," Mr. Wallace shrugged. "Besides, watching you race was payment enough." Lewis felt something twist in his chest. Shame, perhaps, or regret. How many other moments like this had he forgotten? How many people who helped him along the way had he left behind? "Mr. Wallace," Lewis began carefully, "I think I made you a promise once. About helping you retire when I became successful." The old man's eyes widened slightly, then he chuckled. "You were a boy, making boyish promises. Nobody expects children to remember such things." "But I should have remembered," Lewis insisted. "Look at everything you did for me." Mr. Wallace waved his hand dismissively. "I did very little. You would have succeeded without an old janitor cheering you on." "That's not true," Lewis said firmly. "When teachers told me to focus on schoolwork instead of racing, you encouraged me to follow my dream. When kids made fun of my dyslexia, you showed me racing magazines with pictures so I wouldn't feel stupid." Lewis's voice grew more passionate. "When I couldn't understand the math for calculating gear ratios, you taught me using parts from your old toolbox." Mr. Wallace looked down at his plate, seemingly embarrassed by the praise. "You give me too much credit. And you don't take enough," Lewis countered. He reached across the table and gently tapped the scrapbook. "You believed in me more than anyone except my father. And how did I repay you? By forgetting you completely once I got famous." "Now, that's not fair to yourself," Mr. Wallace said firmly. "You had a career to build, championships to win, the whole world watching your every Move. Why would you spare a thought for your old-school janitor? But Louis couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed this kind man. Looking at Mr. Wallace now, his arthritis-swollen hands, the tiredness around his eyes, the way he had savored the restaurant food like it was a rare luxury, Louis felt a deep sense of responsibility. "How are your grandchildren?" Louis asked, changing the subject. Mr. Wallace's face brightened immediately. "Tyler's 10 and Emma's 8. Smart as whips, both of them. Tyler's mad about cars, has all your model Mercedes on his shelf. Doesn't even know his granddad knew you personally. And their mother, your daughter?" "Sarah," Mr. Wallace nodded, "works as a nurse at the Lister Hospital. Night shifts mostly, so I watch the little ones when she's working. Had to cut back my hours at school to help, but we make it work." "It must be hard," Louis said. "Working at your age while helping with the kids." A flicker of weariness crossed Mr. Wallace's face, quickly replaced by determination. Family comes first. Always has. Louis thought about his own family, how his father had worked multiple jobs to fund his racing, how his stepmother had supported them both. He understood sacrifice for family. As they finished their meals, Louis made a decision. "Mr. Wallace, I'd like to meet your family. Would that be possible?" The old man nearly choked on his wine. "Meet my family? But why would you want to?" "I'd like to thank them," Louis said simply, "for sharing you with a boy who needed guidance when you could have been spending that time with them." Mr. Wallace wiped his mouth with his napkin, clearly emotional. "Well, I suppose that could be arranged. The kids would be thrilled, of course, but I wouldn't want to impose on your holiday." "You're not imposing," Louis assured him. "I've got some business to take care of in England for the next few days anyway." This wasn't exactly true. Louis had been planning to fly to Monaco the next morning. But one call to his team had changed those plans. Lewis Hamilton, famous for his laser focus on racing, had suddenly found something more important than his usual between-races routine. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Louis noticed Mr. Wallace wince as he stood up, one hand pressed against his lower back. "Are you all right?" Louis asked, concerned. "Just old bones complaining." Mr. Wallace smiled through obvious pain. "Nothing serious." Louis helped the old man with his jacket, an act that seemed to embarrass Mr. Wallace slightly. "I've arranged for a car to take you home," Louis said gently. "No need for that," Mr. Wallace protested. "The bus stop is just—" "Please," Louis interrupted. "It's the least I can do." Outside, a sleek Mercedes waited by the curb. As the driver held the door open, Mr. Wallace turned to Louis with a searching look. "Why now, Louis?" he asked quietly. "After all these years, why are you suddenly interested in an old man's life?" Louis didn't have a simple answer. "Maybe I needed to remember where I came from," he said finally. "And who helped me get to where I am." After Mr. Wallace departed in the Mercedes, Louis walked back to his hotel through the quiet Stevenage streets. The cool evening air helped clear his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the janitor's scrapbooks, how carefully each article was preserved, how proudly Mr. Wallace spoke about his boy making it big. Back in his hotel suite, Louis kicked off his shoes and sprawled on the couch. He pulled out his phone and searched George Wallace Stevenage Mechanic. Nothing relevant appeared. He tried George Wallace John Henry Newman School. This time, a small article from 15 years ago popped up. "School Janitor Celebrates. 20 fighters. Years of service." The article was brief, mentioning that George Wallace had started working at the school in 1984, around the time Louis was born. Before that, He had indeed worked as a mechanic for a small racing team in the 1960s called Hastings Motors. They had competed in local British racing circuits, nothing international. Lewis dug deeper. With a few calls to racing historians he knew, he learned that Hastings Motors had briefly worked with Stirling Moss, one of Britain's greatest racing drivers, for a test session in 1962. George Wallace had been on that crew. So Mr. Wallace wasn't exaggerating, Lewis murmured to himself. He really did work with racing legends. The next morning, Lewis canceled his flight to Monaco and instead rented a car. He drove to the address Mr. Wallace had given him, a small house on a quiet street about 2 miles from the school. It was a modest home with a tiny, well-kept garden. Lewis noticed the handrail on the front steps had been recently repainted, and there were children's bicycles chained to a post. Mr. Wallace answered the door in casual clothes. The first time Lewis had seen him out of his janitor uniform. He looked somehow smaller without it. "Lewis, I didn't expect you so early," he said, clearly flustered. "Sarah and the kids are out shopping. They'll be heartbroken to have missed you." "Actually, I came to see you," Lewis said. "I was hoping we could talk more. Maybe you could show me around town, the places you used to take your son James to." "Race?" Mr. Wallace's face lit up. "You want to see the old karting track? If it's still there." "Oh, it's there all right. Not as fancy as the ones you race at now, but it's where a lot of local kids still get their start." As they drove to the track in Lewis's rental car, Mr. Wallace pointed out landmarks from his life. The garage where he'd worked after leaving, racing, the park where he'd taught his children to ride bikes, the church where he'd married his late wife Mary. "Mary passed 10 years ago," Mr. Wallace said quietly as they passed the church. "Heart problems. She never got to see you win your championships. She would have been so proud. She always liked you. Said you had good manners when you came to the house that time." Lewis frowned. "I came to your house?" "Just once. Your bike chain broke outside our house, and it was raining. Mary made you hot chocolate while I fixed your bike. You can't have been more than 11. Another memory Lewis had forgotten. How many small kindnesses had this family shown him? Tubby and the karting track. A few kids were racing around the circuit with their parents watching. No one recognized Lewis at first, as he wore a cap pulled low and sunglasses. He and Mr. Wallace stood watching the young racers. "See that boy in the red cart?" Mr. Wallace pointed. "Good lines through the corners. Brakes too early, though." Lewis nodded, impressed by the old man's eye for racing technique. "You really know your stuff." "Told you I did," Mr. Wallace smiled. Then, more seriously, "I used to bring James here every weekend. He was good. Not as good as you, but he had talent. Could have been a decent amateur racer." "Why didn't he pursue it, Mr.?" Wallace's smile faded. "Money. Same reason I left racing. When kids come along, you do what pays the bills, not what you love." He looked at Lewis. "That's why your father was so special. He sacrificed everything for your dream." Lewis nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I know. I've tried to pay him back, but he says seeing me succeed was all he ever wanted." "That's being a parent," Mr. Wallace said simply. "Your children's happiness becomes your own." As they walked slowly around the track, Lewis noticed Mr. Wallace limping slightly. "Is your leg bothering you?" Lewis asked. "Old injury," Mr. Wallace shrugged. "Broke my hip 5 years ago. Slipped on a wet floor at school. Ironic, isn't it? The janitor falling on the floor he just mopped." Lewis stopped walking. "That must have been painful." 6 weeks in hospital, metal pins inserted. Should have retired then, but... Mr. Wallace trailed off. "But you needed the money for your grandchildren." Lewis finished. Mr. Wallace nodded, looking embarrassed. James had just died. Sarah was struggling. The school let me come back part-time at first, just to help with the lighter work. Then the head custodian left, and they asked me to take more hours again. Lewis felt anger rising inside him. An 80-year-old man with a damaged hip, still working long hours, mopping floors. It wasn't right. "What about your pension?" Lewis asked. "It's enough for me, barely," Mr. Wallace admitted, "but not enough to help Sarah with the kids' needs. Tyler has dyslexia, like you did, needs special tutoring, and Emma's got a talent for science. We're saving for a good computer for her projects." As they headed back to the car, Lewis watched how Mr. Wallace moved, carefully, hiding his pain, with practiced skill. His hands, Lewis noticed, were severely swollen with arthritis, the fingers bent at awkward angles. "Do your hands hurt when you work?" Lewis asked gently. Mr. Wallace looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Everything hurts at my age," he said with a small laugh. "You get used to it." But Lewis could see the truth. This proud man was in constant pain, pushing through it day after day to help his family. On the drive back to Mr. Wallace's house, Lewis asked more questions about Sarah and the grandchildren. He learned that Sarah worked 12-hour night shifts at the hospital. The children stayed with Mr. Wallace overnight when she worked, which was 4 nights a week. "I pick them up from school, help with homework, make dinner, get them to bed," Mr. Wallace explained. "Then up at 5 to get them ready before I head to work. Sarah comes home and takes over." "That's a lot for someone your age," Lewis observed. "Family is family," Mr. Wallace said firmly. "You do what needs doing." When they arrived back at the house, Lewis could hear children's voices inside. Sarah had returned with Tyler and Emma. "Would you like to meet them?" Mr. Wallace asked, a hint of pride in his voice. "Very much," Lewis nodded. The front door burst open, and 2 children raced out, stopping abruptly when they spotted Lewis. "Granddad, Mom says Lewis Hamilton is really coming to visit. Is it true?" the boy asked excitedly. Then he noticed Lewis standing by the car. His mouth fell open. "Tyler, Emma, this is my friend Lewis," Mr. Wallace said calmly, as if introducing an ordinary neighbor. "Lewis, these are my grandchildren." 10-year-old Tyler looked like he might faint. 8-year-old Emma, with her grandfather's kind eyes, stepped forward confidently. "Do you really drive 300 kilometers per hour?" she asked seriously. Lewis crouched down to her level. "Sometimes a bit faster, if the car is running well." "Aren't you scared?" she persisted. "Every single time," Lewis admitted. "But that's how you know you're alive." A woman appeared in the doorway. Sarah Wallace. She had her father's gentle face, but looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, clearly caught off guard by the famous visitor. "Mr. Hamilton," she said uncertainly. "Dad told me you might stop by, but we didn't expect. The house isn't—" "Please, call me Lewis," he interrupted her apology with a warm smile. "And your home is lovely. Your father has been kind enough to show me around town today. I hope I'm not interrupting your family time." Sarah gave her father a questioning look, clearly wondering why a 7-time Formula One champion was suddenly spending time with the elderly janitor. "Lewis and I are old friends," Mr. Wallace explained, putting his arm around his daughter. "He was just a boy when I first met him, but I always knew he'd be special." Lewis caught the skepticism in Sarah's eyes. She was protective of her father, suspicious, perhaps, of this sudden interest from a celebrity. Lewis respected that. She didn't know him, had no reason to trust his intentions. Perhaps I could come in for just a few minutes, Louis suggested. I'd love to hear about your children's interests. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Of course. We don't have much to offer except tea. Tea would be perfect, Louis assured her. As they walked toward the modest house, Louis noticed Tyler limping slightly, mirroring his grandfather's gait. What happened to your leg, Tyler? Louis asked gently. Football injury, the boy explained. The doctors say I need special shoes, but they're really expensive, so we're saving up. Louis caught Sarah's embarrassed look and Mr. Wallace's small sigh. Another financial burden this struggling family was bearing. Inside the small living room, Louis spotted his autobiography on the bookshelf, well worn from multiple readings. On the walls were several Formula One posters, including one of Louis in his Mercedes, signed by the entire team, a competition prize Tyler had won at school. The grandchildren didn't even know their grandfather had once helped the famous Lewis Hamilton. The realization hit Louis hard. George Wallace was too modest to use their connection, even to impress his own grandchildren. Something needed to change, and Louis suddenly knew with perfect clarity that he was the one who needed to make it happen. Something needed to change, and Louis suddenly knew with perfect clarity that he was the one who needed to make it happen. While the Wallace family bustled around serving tea in their best cups, Louis sent a quick text message to Toto Wolff. Plan confirmed. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. Louis spent an hour with the family. He answered Tyler's excited questions about racing, listened to Emma explain her science project on car aerodynamics, and observed how Sarah watched her father with loving concern as he struggled to carry the tea tray despite his arthritic hands. When it was time to leave, Louis knelt down to the children's level. I have an idea, he said. How would you like to see a real Formula One factory tomorrow? Tyler's eyes nearly popped out of his head. The Mercedes factory? For real? If your mom and granddad agree, Louis nodded, looking up at Sarah and Mr. Wallace. Sarah shook her head. That's incredibly kind, but I have work, and Dad, I've already arranged a car to take you all to Brackley, Louis interrupted gently. It's only about an hour from here, just for the morning. I'd really like to show your father something. Mr. Wallace looked confused. Show me what? Just trust me, Louis smiled. Consider it a thank you for all those times you helped a skinny kid with big dreams. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Louis couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, with ideas. He made call after call, to his financial advisor, to his lawyer, to his foundation manager, to Mercedes team officials. By 3 a.m., he had the outline of a plan. Lewis Hamilton had donated millions to various charities over the years. He supported education for underprivileged children, environmental causes, and animal welfare. But this was different. This was personal. He pulled out his laptop and began researching. He looked up the salary range for school janitors in England, dismally low. The cost of specialized orthopedic shoes for children, shockingly high, and the price of houses in Stevenage, more expensive than he remembered. By morning, Louis had slept only 2 hours, but he felt more energized than before a race. He showered, dressed, and headed to the Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team factory in Brackley, ahead of the Wallace family. Toto Wolff, the team principal, was waiting for him in the lobby. The tall Austrian gave Louis a warm handshake. So, this is the janitor who inspired Lewis Hamilton? Toto asked with a smile. I was intrigued by your call. He did more than inspire me, Louis explained as they walked toward Toto's office. He believed in me when most people thought I was just a kid with impossible dreams. And now he's 80 years old in pain every day, still working to support his family. Toto's expression grew serious. And you want to help him? Noble. But why involve the team? Louis had anticipated this question. Because I want to do more than just write a check. I want to create something lasting, something that helps other kids like I was, and I need Mercedes to be part of it. Toto's office, Louis outlined his idea. The team principal listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. When Louis finished, Toto sat back in his chair. Ambitious, he said finally, but I like it. The board will need convincing about the funding, but I'll support it. I'll put in most of the money myself, Louis assured him. I just need Mercedes. We'll do our part, Toto interrupted, standing up. After all, you've won us enough championships to justify some goodwill investment. A message came through on Toto's phone. They're here, he said. Your special guests have arrived at security. 20 minutes later, Mr. Wallace, Sarah, Tyler, and Emma were being escorted through the gleaming Mercedes factory. Tyler was practically floating with excitement, pointing at every car component they passed. Emma asked detailed questions about the wind tunnel testing that impressed even the engineers. Sarah seemed overwhelmed but happy to see her children so thrilled. Mr. Wallace moved slowly, taking everything in with quiet appreciation. Unlike his grandchildren, he understood exactly what he was seeing. The evolution of racing technology from his time to now. The principles are still the same, he murmured, as they examined a cutaway engine display. Just more precise, more powerful. Louis watched with satisfaction as the tour guide explained the engineering behind the Mercedes power unit. When Mr. Wallace made a comment about valve timing, the young engineer giving the tour looked surprised. That's exactly right, she said. How did you know that? I worked on racing engines myself, many years ago, Mr. Wallace explained modestly. The engineer looked at Louis with new understanding. This wasn't just a random family being given a VIP tour. This was someone who spoke the language of racing. For lunch, they gathered in the team's private dining room. Several mechanics and engineers joined them, and to Louis's delight, they quickly engaged Mr. Wallace in technical conversations about the old and new ways of racing. The elderly janitor seemed to grow younger before Louis's eyes, animated by the chance to talk about his first passion. Toto Wolff appeared midway through lunch, introducing himself to the family. He presented Tyler and Emma with team merchandise, caps, T-shirts, and a small model of Louis's car. But he saved the best gift for Mr. Wallace, a perfectly restored miniature toolbox containing precision tools from the 1960s, the era when he had worked as a racing mechanic. Mr. Hamilton tells me these were the kind you used to use, Toto said, opening the box to reveal the gleaming tools inside. Mr. Wallace's hands trembled as he touched one of the wrenches. Just like my old set, he whispered. I had to sell mine. When my first child was born, needed the money for a crib. Louis caught Sarah wiping away a tear as she watched her father carefully examine each tool. She looked at Louis with a mix of confusion and gratitude, clearly wondering why a famous racing driver was being so kind to her family. After lunch, Louis asked if he could speak privately with Mr. Wallace and Sarah. Toto arranged for Tyler and Emma to sit in a real F1 car, while the adults talked in a conference room overlooking the factory floor. I have a proposition, Louis began once they were seated, and I want you both to hear me out completely before you respond. Mr. Wallace and Sarah exchanged worried glances. It's nothing bad, Louis assured them with a smile. In fact, I hope you'll think it's quite good. It's nothing bad, Louis assured them with a smile. In fact, I hope you'll think it's quite good. Sarah sat stiffly in her chair, her nurse's uniform crisp despite the long day. She had taken precious time off work for this trip and seemed determined to protect her father from whatever was coming. "Mr. Wallace," Lewis began, then corrected himself. "George, I need to ask you something important, and I want an honest answer." "Your puit," old man nodded cautiously. "I've always been honest with you, Lewis. Why are you still working at 80 years old? The full truth, please." Mr. Wallace sighed, glancing at his daughter. "I've told you, to help with the grandchildren." "But there's more to it, isn't there?" Lewis pressed gently. Sarah spoke up, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Dad's pension barely covers his own needs. After James died, there were debts. Medical bills, the funeral." She swallowed hard. "James had a small auto repair shop. It was failing when he died. He'd taken out loans to keep it going. Those debts fell to me." Mr. Wallace reached for his daughter's hand. "Sarah didn't want me to keep working, but what choice did we have? The children need things. Special shoes for Tyler. A computer for Emma's schoolwork. Their father left years ago, pays no support. Sarah works as hard as she can, but nursing doesn't pay what it should." Lewis nodded, taking this in. "And James, I remember him vaguely from school. What exactly happened to him?" The pain in both their faces told Lewis this was still a raw wound. 5 years ago," Mr. Wallace began, his voice steady but sad. "James was driving home from work when he saw a car crash on Burton Road. The car caught fire with a young mother and her baby trapped inside. James stopped to help. He got them both out safely." The old man's voice broke slightly. "But when he went back for the woman's purse, she was screaming about her identification being in there. The car exploded." Sarah wiped away a tear. "He died a hero, but that doesn't make it any easier." The local paper ran a small story, Mr. Wallace continued, called him a local hero. There was a small plaque put up near the accident site, but within a month, everyone had forgotten. Life moved on. Lewis felt a heaviness in his chest. A man had died saving others, and the world had barely noticed. Meanwhile, Lewis made headlines just for changing his hairstyle. "And his auto shop?" Lewis asked. "It had to be sold to pay debts," Sarah explained. "It was just a small place on Argyle Street. James loved that shop. Started it with money he saved working at the big dealership for 10 years. But times were tough. He couldn't compete with the bigger garages." Lewis made some notes on his phone, then looked up at them both. "I want to help you." Sarah immediately stiffened. "We don't need charity, Mr. Hamilton." "It's not charity," Lewis said quickly. "It's repayment." Mr. Wallace frowned. "Repayment for what?" "For all the times you helped me when I was young. For believing in me when most people thought I was just a kid with an impossible dream." Lewis leaned forward. "George, I made a promise to you when I was 15. I said that when I became a successful racing driver, I'd make sure you could retire comfortably. I forgot that promise as my career took off. I'm ashamed of that. But I'd like to keep it now, if you'll let me." Sarah looked confused. "Dad, you never told me Lewis Hamilton made you a promise." "It was just boy talk," Mr. Wallace said, embarrassed. "Kids say things. I never expected anything." "But I should have remembered," Lewis insisted. "I want to create a foundation, the Wallace Foundation for Education and Mechanical Arts. It would provide scholarships for underprivileged youth interested in motorsport and engineering, especially those with learning disabilities like dyslexia." He turned to a slide presentation on the conference room screen, showing preliminary designs for a building. The Foundation's first project would be the George Wallace Technical Academy in Stevenage. It would offer free courses in car mechanics, engineering and technical skills. And George, I'd like you to be the honorary president, with a salary that would allow you to retire from your janitor position." Mr. Wallace's mouth fell open. Sarah looked stunned. That's too much," the old man stammered. "There's more," Lewis continued, clicking to the next slide. "I've looked into James's old auto shop. The building is currently vacant. I'd like to buy it, renovate it with modern equipment, and reopen it as a training facility for the academy's students. It would also be a working business, employing graduates from the program." He looked directly at Sarah. "And I'd like you to manage the business operations, if you're interested. The salary would be considerably more than what you make as a nurse." Sarah's professional composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. "Why would you do all this for us? You barely know us." Lewis thought carefully before answering. "When I was 12, a teacher told me that my dream of becoming a Formula One driver was unrealistic, that I should focus on something more achievable. I went home crying and told my dad I wanted to quit. He was about to agree that maybe racing was too expensive, too unlikely." He looked at Mr. Wallace. "But the next day, you pulled me aside at school. You'd noticed I was upset. You told me about working with Sterling Moss's team briefly in the 1960s. You said you recognized the same spark in me that you'd seen in real racers. You told me not to give up just because the path was hard." Mr. Wallace nodded slowly, remembering. "I meant it too." "I know you did," Lewis said. "That conversation changed my life. I went home and told my dad I wanted to keep trying. If you hadn't encouraged me that day, I might have quit. No championships, no Mercedes, nothing." Lewis stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the factory floor where engineers were assembling the cars that had carried him to victory. So many times, success like mine, it's not just talent or hard work. It's also luck. The luck of having people who believe in you at crucial moments. He turned back to face them. "I can't repay that luck directly, but I can pass it forward. That's what this foundation would do." Sarah looked at her father, seeking guidance. Mr. Wallace sat quietly for a long moment, then asked, "What about the children? Tyler and Emma?" "The foundation would cover their educational needs," Lewis assured him. "Tyler's special shoes, Emma's computer, whatever they need. Plus guaranteed spots at the academy when they're older, if they're interested." "It's too much," Mr. Wallace repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Actually," Lewis smiled, "it's not nearly enough, but it's a start." Sarah reached for her father's hand. "Dad, I think you should say yes, not just for yourself, but for James's memory, and for all the kids like Lewis who need someone to believe in them." Mr. Wallace looked at Lewis, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You really want to name it after me? Wouldn't it get more attention with your name?" "That's exactly why it should have your name," Lewis said firmly. "The world knows plenty about Lewis Hamilton. It's time they learned about George Wallace, the man who helped make my success possible." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lewis extended his stay in England, canceling appearances in Monaco and rescheduling sponsor meetings. For once, racing took a back seat to something more important. After the Wallace family agreed to his proposal, Lewis assembled a team to make it happen. His longtime lawyer flew in from London. His financial advisor joined via video call. A property agent in Stevenage began scouting locations for the academy. Lewis spent hours on the phone with the Mercedes team's public relations department, explaining his vision. Though they initially pushed to have the team's branding prominently featured, Lewis was firm. "This isn't about Mercedes or me," he insisted during one call, pacing his hotel room. It's about George Wallace and creating opportunities for kids like I was. The Mercedes logo can be there, but it can't overshadow the purpose. 3 days after the factory tour, Lewis drove to the Wallace home again. This time, he brought his team with him, his lawyer, the property agent, and a representative from his charitable foundation. Sarah had the day off from the hospital. She had prepared sandwiches and tea, clearly nervous about hosting such important visitors in their modest home. Mr. Wallace had polished his shoes and wore his best sweater, despite the warm weather. "We've made some progress," Lewis explained as they gathered around the small dining table covered with papers. "We've located James's old shop on Argyle Street. It's been empty for 2 years. The current owner is willing to sell." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're really going to buy James's shop?" "If you approve," Lewis nodded. "We'd need to completely renovate it, update all the equipment. But the location is perfect, close to schools, easy access from main roads." The property agent showed them renderings of what the renovated shop could look like, with modern lifts, diagnostic equipment, and a classroom area. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, clearly emotional at seeing her brother's dream shop transformed. "For the main academy," Lewis continued, "we've found 2 possible locations." The agent showed photos of an old community center that had closed due to lack of funding and a former technical college building on the outskirts of town. As the adults discussed logistics, Tyler and Emma played in the backyard. Lewis watched them through the window, Tyler showing his sister how to kick a football despite his leg brace, Emma helping him up when he fell. They supported each other naturally, the way siblings should. During a break, Lewis stepped outside to join them. Emma immediately challenged him to a race across the yard. Despite her head start, Lewis let her win by just a fraction, making her beam with pride. "Mr. Hamilton," Tyler said seriously after the race, "when I grow up, I want to be a racing driver, like you." Lewis sat down on the grass beside the boy. "Why do you want to race?" Tyler thought for a moment. "Because when you're racing, nothing else matters. Not the bad stuff at school, not the doctors, not my stupid leg. Just the next corner." Lewis nodded, understanding completely. "That's exactly why I love it too." "Mom says it's too expensive," Tyler added quietly. "And dangerous." "Your mom is right about both things," Lewis admitted. "But there are many ways to be part of racing without driving. Engineers, mechanics, team managers, they're all just as important as drivers. But not as famous," Tyler pointed out. Lewis laughed. "Fame isn't all it's cracked up to be, trust me. The best part of my job isn't the fame, it's the feeling of pushing myself and my car to the absolute limit. You can get that same feeling in lots of different ways." Emma, who had been listening, spoke up. "I want to design racing cars, not drive them. Mummy says I'm good at science." "The world needs more women engineers," Lewis told her. "Maybe you'll design the car I drive when I'm an old man still racing." Later, Lewis took a walk with Mr. Wallace around the neighborhood. "See," old man moved slowly, but his spirits seemed brighter than before. "The school called," Mr. Wallace said as they walked. "They want to know when I'm coming back to work." "What did you tell them?" Lewis asked. "That I'm thinking about retirement," Mr. Wallace smiled. They were shocked. "I've been there so long, I think they assumed I'd die with a mop in my hand." Lewis winced at the image. "You deserve to rest, George." "I don't know about rest," the old man said thoughtfully. "But I'd like to spend my time doing something meaningful. This academy idea of yours, you really think I could help run it?" "I'm counting on it," Lewis said firmly. "Who better to inspire young mechanics than someone who's worked on cars from the 1960s to today?" Your experience is priceless." Mr. Wallace seemed to stand a little straighter at these words. "I could teach them about engine timing, about listening to the sounds a car makes when something's wrong, things they don't learn from computers these days." "Exactly," Lewis nodded. "Plus, you know how to talk to kids who think they can't succeed. Kids like I was." When they returned to the house, Lewis's lawyer was explaining the foundation structure to Sarah. There would be a board of directors, with Lewis as chairman and Mr. Wallace as president. Sarah would serve as operations director, overseeing both the academy and the auto shop. "It's a lot of responsibility," Sarah said nervously. "I'm a nurse, not a business manager." "You'll have help," Lewis assured her. "My foundation team will handle the financial and legal aspects, and we'll hire experienced staff. Your job will be making sure everything stays true to the vision, helping kids like Tyler and Emma build better futures." That evening, Lewis stayed for dinner. It was a simple meal, spaghetti and meatballs that Tyler had helped prepare, but one of the most enjoyable Lewis had eaten in months. There was laughter around the table, stories shared, and none of the formality Lewis had grown used to at sponsor dinners and team events. As they ate, Lewis noticed his autobiography on the bookshelf again. After dinner, he asked Tyler to bring it to him. "I haven't properly signed this," Lewis said, taking out a pen. He opened to the first page and wrote, "To Tyler and Emma, dream big, work hard, and remember that champions come in many forms. Your grandfather is one of mine. Lewis. Hamilton." Tyler read the inscription wide-eyed, then showed it to his sister. "Granddad, did you really help Lewis Hamilton when he was a kid?" Mr. Wallace looked embarrassed. "I just encouraged him a bit, that's all." "That's not all," Lewis corrected gently. "Your grandfather saw potential in me when most people didn't. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person who believes in you." Later, as Lewis prepared to leave, Sarah walked him to his car. She had been quiet for much of the evening, seemingly processing all that was happening. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked directly when they were alone. "The truth, please. This is about more than some childhood promise." Lewis considered her question carefully. "When I visit schools now, kids look at me like I'm a superhero, like my success was inevitable. They don't see all the people who helped me along the way." He leaned against his car. "I've won almost everything there is to win in my sport. But lately, I've been asking myself, what's it all for? Fast cars and big houses only mean so much." Sarah nodded, understanding. "You want to give back." "More than that," Lewis said. "I want to rebalance things. Your father gave me something valuable when I was young. I didn't realize how valuable until now. This foundation, it's about acknowledging that my success isn't just mine. It belongs partly to people like George, who believed in me." Sarah studied him for a moment, then seemed satisfied with his answer. "Dad hasn't seemed this energized in years. After James died, something in him just faded. But talking about this academy, seeing his grandchildren excited, it's brought him back to life. I've scheduled a press conference next week at Silverstone before the British Grand Prix," Lewis told her. "I'd like your father to be there when I announce the foundation." Sarah's eyes widened. "On TV? Dad will be terrified." "He doesn't have to speak," Lewis assured her. "Just stand beside me. Let the world see the man who helped shape Lewis Hamilton." As Lewis drove back to his hotel that night, his phone buzzed constantly with messages from his team about upcoming races and sponsor obligations. The world of Formula One continued its relentless pace. But for the first time in years, Lewis felt his perspective shifting. Trophies and records would always matter to him. He was too competitive by nature for them not to. But perhaps there were other ways to measure success, ways that had nothing to do with checkered flags and champagne. Silverstone Circuit buzzed with excitement. The British Grand Prix weekend had arrived, bringing the usual flood of fans, media, and celebrities to the historic track. Union Jack flags fluttered in the breeze as spectators filed in, eager for a glimpse of their racing heroes. In the Mercedes hospitality suite, Lewis paced nervously. He had faced the media thousands of times before, but today felt different. Today wasn't about lap times or championship points. It was about something more personal. "You're more nervous than before a race," observed Toto Wolff, watching Lewis adjust his collar for the third time. "Different kind of pressure," Lewis admitted. "On the track, I only risk myself. Today, I'm making promises about other people's futures." The door opened, and Mr. Wallace entered with Sarah and the children. They looked overwhelmed by the luxury of the hospitality area and the buzz of activity around them. Mr. Wallace wore a new suit that Lewis had arranged for him. Conservative, dark blue, perfectly tailored to his thin frame. He looked distinguished, his white hair neatly combed, standing straighter than Lewis had seen before. Tyler and Emma were wide-eyed, dressed in their Sunday best, clutching small Mercedes flags. Sarah had managed a rare day off from the hospital and wore a simple but elegant dress, though she kept checking her phone, a nurse's habit of always being on call. "You all look wonderful," Lewis said, greeting them warmly. "How are you feeling, George?" "Like a fish out of water," the old man admitted with a nervous smile. "Never thought I'd see the inside of a Formula One paddock." "You deserve to be here. More than most," Lewis assured him. "Remember, you don't have to say anything at the press conference. Just stand with me. Your presence says everything needed." Mercedes had arranged VIP passes for the Wallace family for the entire race weekend. After the press conference, they would watch qualifying from the team garage, then attend the race the following day as Lewis's special guests. A press officer appeared at the door. "5 minutes, Lewis. The media room is full." Lewis nodded, then turned to the Wallace family. "Ready?" They walked together through the paddock, turning heads as they passed. Fans called Lewis's name, and reporters tried to shout questions, wondering who the elderly man and family accompanying their champion might be. The Silverstone Media Center was packed. Journalists from around the world had gathered, expecting the usual pre-race discussion about strategy and car performance. What they got instead was Lewis Hamilton walking in with an elderly man and his family. Lewis took his place at the microphone, with Mr. Wallace standing beside him. Sarah and the children sat in the front row. "Good morning, everyone," Lewis began. "I know you're all expecting me to talk about this weekend's race. I'll get to that. But first, I want to introduce you to someone special. Someone who helped make Lewis Hamilton possible." He gestured to Mr. Wallace. "This is George Wallace. When I was a student at the John Henry Newman Catholic School in Stevenage, George was the school janitor. He was also a former racing mechanic who recognized something in a skinny, dyslexic kid with big dreams." The room had fallen completely. Silent, all cameras and eyes fixed on the unlikely pair at the front. The world champion and the elderly janitor. When teachers told me to focus on more realistic goals, George encouraged me to keep racing. When bullies made school difficult, he gave me a safe place to eat lunch. When my cart had mechanical problems, he stayed after work to help fix them. Lewis placed a hand on Mr. Wallace's shoulder. "A few days ago, I visited my old school and found George still working there. At 80 years old, with arthritis in his hands and a damaged hip, he's still mopping floors to support his family after losing his son in a tragic accident." There was a murmur through the press room. This was not the usual Formula One press conference content. "Today, I'm proud to announce the creation of the Wallace Foundation for Education and Mechanical Arts. Lewis continued, I'm personally funding it with £5 million, and Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team has generously committed an additional $2 million. Cameras clicked rapidly as Lewis unveiled a rendering of a modern building with George Wallace Technical Academy above the entrance. This academy will provide free education in automotive technology and engineering for underprivileged youth, with special focus on supporting students with learning disabilities like dyslexia. George Wallace will serve as honorary president. Mr. Trelawny Wallace stood tall beside Lewis, his eyes glistening but his expression dignified. Lewis could see the old man was making a tremendous effort to maintain his composure in front of the cameras. Additionally, Lewis continued, we'll be reopening and modernizing the auto repair shop formerly owned by James Wallace, George's late son, who died heroically saving a mother and child from a burning car. The shop will serve as a training facility and employment opportunity for Academy graduates. Lewis gestured to Sarah in the front row. Sarah Wallace, George's daughter and a dedicated NHS nurse, will oversee operations. The first students will be admitted this autumn. A journalist raised his hand. Lewis, this is wonderful. But what prompted this sudden initiative? Why now? Lewis had anticipated this question. He glanced at Mr. Wallace, then back to the room, full of reporters. Because I made a promise 25 years ago that I forgot to keep. When I was 15, I promised George that when I became successful, I'd make sure he could retire comfortably. Life got busy, fame came, and I forgot about the people who helped me get here. The honesty in Lewis's voice resonated through the room. Even the most cynical journalists could see this was deeply personal for the champion. Success in Formula One requires talent and hard work, yes, but it also requires luck. The luck of having people who believe in you at crucial moments. George Wallace believed in me when it mattered most. This foundation is my way of paying that forward. Another reporter raised her hand. Mr. Wallace, how does it feel to have a world-famous former student create a foundation in your name? Mr. Wallace looked startled at being addressed directly. He hesitated, then leaned toward the microphone. Overwhelming, he said simply, his voice quiet but clear. I'm just a janitor who loves cars. I never expected recognition for doing what any decent person would do, encouraging a child with a dream. He straightened his shoulders slightly. But I'm proud to be part of something that will help other young people find their path. The simplicity and humility of his answer touched everyone in the room. Even hardened sports journalists felt their eyes misting slightly. Lewis wrapped up the conference by answering a few questions about the upcoming race, but it was clear that the Wallace Foundation announcement had overshadowed all racing news. As they left the media center, reporters crowded around, wanting more details about George Wallace and his connection to the champion. Back in the Mercedes hospitality area, Mr. Wallace sank gratefully into a chair. That was terrifying, he admitted with a shaky laugh. How do you do that all the time? You get used to it, Lewis smiled. You did wonderfully, George. Perfectly dignified. Tyler bounced excitedly around the room. Granddad's going to be on TV. All my friends will see. You were so brave up there, Dad, Sarah said, squeezing her father's hand. A Mercedes team member appeared with a message for Lewis. The team principals from Ferrari and Red Bull would like to speak with you. Lewis nodded, excusing himself. In the corridor, he found his rivals waiting. Impressive announcement, said the Ferrari boss. We'd like to contribute to your foundation as well. Technical education benefits everyone in motorsport. The Red Bull principal nodded agreement. Count us in, too. Different teams on track, But some initiatives transcend competition. By the time Lewis returned to the hospitality suite, 3 more teams had pledged support. What had begun as his personal project was quickly becoming a motorsport community initiative. Mr. Wallace looked up as Lewis re-entered the room. "What's happening now?" Lewis smiled broadly. "The foundation just grew by several million pounds. Turns out your story resonates with more than just me." The old janitor shook his head, in disbelief. "All those years mopping floors, I never imagined." "This is just the beginning," Lewis promised. "Wait until you see what happens next." "This is just the beginning," Lewis promised. "Wait until you see what happens next." The British Grand Prix weekend continued with a whirlwind of activity. After the press conference, the Wallace family watched qualifying from the Mercedes garage. The team engineers took special time to explain everything to Tyler and Emma, showing them the car's sophisticated systems and the banks of computers that monitored every aspect of performance. Mr. Wallace found himself deep in conversation with the team's senior mechanics. Despite the generation gap in their experiences, they spoke the same language of engines, aerodynamics, and the pursuit of speed. The old janitor's knowledge of classic racing surprised and impressed the younger technicians. Lewis qualified in pole position, his concentration laser-sharp despite the emotional events of the previous days. As he climbed from his car after the final qualifying session, he immediately sought out the Wallace family. "That was for you, George," he said, still sweating in his racing suit. "Front row tomorrow." Race day arrived with perfect weather. Sunny but not too hot. Ideal racing conditions. The Wallace family had been given a special guest box overlooking the start-finish straight. They wore Mercedes team gear and VIP passes, looking excited but slightly out of place among celebrities and racing dignitaries. Mr. Wallace appeared transformed from the tired janitor Lewis had first encountered days ago. He sat straighter, his eyes brighter, his hands steady as he explained racing strategies to his grandchildren. The burden of constant work seemed to have lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose and recognition. "Lewis is going to win today," Tyler declared confidently. "I can feel it." "Racing isn't that simple, lad," Mr. Wallace cautioned. "Anything can happen. That's why we love it. The uncertainty." As the cars lined up on the grid, Lewis's mind was unusually clear. Normally before a race, especially his home Grand Prix with all its pressures and expectations, he felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. Today, those feelings were present but muted beneath something stronger. A sense of racing for something beyond himself. When the lights went out and 20 powerful machines launched forward, Lewis made a perfect start. But by the first corner, Max Verstappen in the Red Bull had pulled alongside him. The two champions, fierce rivals for years, battled wheel to wheel through the opening laps. In the guest box, Mr. Wallace watched intently, occasionally making observations about racing lines and tire management that impressed even the racing experts seated nearby. Tyler and Emma cheered wildly each time Lewis's car flashed past, while Sarah alternated between covering her eyes during particularly close moments and shouting encouragement along with her children. Midway through the race, Lewis made a bold strategy decision, pitting early for fresh tires. It dropped him to third place behind Verstappen and a Ferrari, but with potentially faster pace for the final laps. "Risky," Mr. Wallace commented, leaning forward in his seat. "But smart if the tires hold up." The race built to a thrilling climax. With 10 laps remaining, Lewis caught and passed the Ferrari. With 5 to go, he was on Verstappen's tail, looking for any opportunity to overtake. In the garage, the Mercedes team held their breath. In the guest box, the Wallace family could barely stay in their seats. On the final lap, at the fast Stowe corner, Lewis saw his chance. He feinted to the inside, then switched to a wider line, carrying more speed through the corner than seemed possible. For a heart-stopping moment, his car slid toward the edge of the track, but Lewis maintained perfect control. He emerged from the corner ahead of Verstappen, the crowd erupting in cheers that could be heard even over the screaming engines. Lewis Hamilton crossed the line to win the British Grand Prix by less than a second, one of the closest finishes in years. After the podium celebration, where Lewis dedicated his victory to someone who believed in me when no one else did, the U.S. champion joined the Wallace family in the Mercedes hospitality area. He was still damp from champagne, his race suit tied around his waist, face glowing with the unique exhilaration that comes from pushing human and machine to their absolute limits. "That was amazing!" Tyler exclaimed, bouncing with excitement. "The way you passed Verstappen on that last lap, I thought you were going to crash," Lewis laughed. "So did I, for a split second, but the car stuck to the track." "Your entry angle was perfect," Mr. Wallace observed quietly. "Just like at the karting track all those years ago. You always had a feel for how far you could push before losing grip." Lewis looked at the old man with surprise and gratitude. After all the fame and success, here was someone who had known him before it all began, who saw the same driver in the 7-time world champion as in the 12-year-old kart racer. Later, in the post-race press conference, a journalist asked what had inspired Lewis's particularly brave move on the final lap. Lewis took a moment before answering. "I was driving for more than just myself today," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes in racing, we get so caught up in championships and statistics that we forget why we started doing this in the first place. For the pure joy of it, for the challenge." He paused, then continued more personally than usual. "Having Mr. Wallace and his family here reminded me of something important from my early days. When I was 14 years old, I was ready to quit racing." The room full of journalists fell silent. This was not a story Lewis had ever shared publicly before. My family had spent every penny on my racing. The bullying at school had gotten worse, with kids mocking my dreams and my dyslexia. Schoolwork was getting harder, and I was falling behind because reading was so difficult for me. Lewis's voice grew quieter, but the room was so still that everyone could hear him perfectly. One day after school, I was sitting alone in an empty classroom, crying. I was going to tell my dad that night that I wanted to stop racing, that it was too hard, too expensive, too unlikely to ever work out. He took a sip of water, gathering his thoughts. Mr. Wallace found me there while doing his cleaning rounds. Instead of leaving me alone or offering empty encouragement, he sat down and really listened. Then he told me something that changed everything. The journalists leaned forward, captivated by this glimpse into the champion's formative years. Saranhi told me he had once been a mechanic for a team that worked with Sterling Moss, one of Britain's greatest drivers. He had to give up that career when his family needed more stable income. He never got to fulfill his racing dreams. Lewis's eyes seemed focused on something distant, remembering. He said to me, "Don't let anything stop you. Not money, not bullies, not learning problems. You have a gift. I recognize it because I once knew men with that same fire in their eyes. Promise me you'll never quit, and I promise I'll help however I can." Lewis looked directly into the cameras now, his expression earnest. Mr. Wallace then started staying late at school to help me with my homework, finding ways to work around my dyslexia. He spoke to teachers about giving me extra time on tests. He even fixed my cart a few times when my dad couldn't figure out the problem. Lewis smiled softly. I wouldn't be sitting here today with 7 world championships if not for Mr. Wallace, believing in me at that crucial moment. Today's race, especially that last lap, wasn't about me helping him. It was about finally acknowledging how much he helped me. The story made headlines around the world. By that evening, Mr. Wallace was no longer just a local human interest story. He had become a symbol of the unsung heroes behind every success story. The mentors who offer crucial support at pivotal moments. Back at the hotel that night, Lewis hosted a private dinner for the Wallace family. As they celebrated the race victory and the successful foundation launch, Lewis noticed Mr. Wallace seemed pensive. "Everything all right, George?" Lewis asked quietly, while the others were distracted by dessert. The old man nodded slowly. "More than all right. I was just thinking, all those years mopping floors, I sometimes wondered if I'd made the right choice, leaving racing behind." He looked at his daughter and grandchildren, then back to Lewis. "Now I know I did. Some races aren't run on tracks. Some championships don't come with trophies." Lewis understood completely. In racing toward his own dreams, he had almost missed the chance to honor one of the people who made those dreams possible. But sometimes, if you're lucky, life gives you a chance to correct your course before it's too late. As Tyler eagerly asked Lewis questions about race strategy, and Emma described her ideas for more aerodynamic car designs, Lewis watched Mr. Wallace's face light up with pride. The old janitor might never have become a famous racing mechanic, but his influence would now help countless young people find their own paths to success. And that, Lewis realized, was a legacy far greater than any racing trophy could ever be. 6 months later, a crowd gathered on a crisp autumn morning in Stevenage. The newly constructed George Wallace Technical Academy stood gleaming in the winter sunlight, its modern architecture blending seamlessly with elements of classic automotive design. The main entrance featured a sweeping curve reminiscent of a racetrack, while the glass walls displayed vintage and modern racing cars inside. News vans and cameras surrounded the building. What had begun as Lewis Hamilton's personal project had grown into a major educational initiative, with support from across the motorsport world. All 10 Formula One teams had contributed funding or equipment. Major car manufacturers had donated engines, parts, and diagnostic tools. Even the Royal Automobile Club had established a scholarship fund. Mr. Wallace stood near the entrance, dressed in a tailored suit, with a blue tie that matched the Academy's colors. At 81, he looked decades younger than the tired janitor Lewis had discovered mopping floors half a year ago. His back was straighter, his movements more energetic, his eyes bright with purpose. Beside him, Sarah wore a smart business outfit, her nurse's uniform now reserved for volunteer work only. As operations director of both the Academy and the renovated auto shop, she had discovered organizational talents she never knew she possessed. The constant exhaustion that had marked her face had faded, replaced by confidence. Tyler and Emma darted excitedly among the crowd, proudly showing visitors around Granddad's school. Tyler walked with only the slightest hint of a limp, his special orthopedic shoes, the best money could buy, supporting his growing frame. Emma carried a tablet with the Academy's curriculum she had helped design, eager to show everyone how students would learn both traditional mechanics and cutting-edge automotive technology. Lewis arrived without fanfare, slipping through a side entrance to avoid stealing attention from the real stars of the day. He found Mr. Wallace checking last-minute details in the main workshop. "Nervous?" Lewis asked, straightening the old man's tie. "Terrified," Mr. Wallace admitted with a smile. "Public speaking was never my strong suit." "Just speak from the heart," Lewis advised. "That's what you've always done." The ceremony began at precisely 10 a.m. Local officials, education leaders, and motorsport representatives gathered on a stage set up in front of the Academy. The crowd included current students from Lewis's old school, aspiring mechanics from across the region, and many of Mr. Wallace's former colleagues. Toto Wolff spoke briefly about Mercedes's commitment to education and diversity in motorsport. Several other team principals echoed similar sentiments. A government minister praised the initiative as a model for public-private partnership in technical education. Then Lewis took the microphone, dressed not in his racing gear or designer clothes, but in a simple academy staff shirt with "Instructor" embroidered below the logo. 6 months ago, I rediscovered something I had lost sight of during my racing career. Lewis began. I rediscovered the importance of those who believe in us when we struggle to believe in ourselves. He gestured to Mr. Wallace. This man changed my life with a simple act of kindness and encouragement. Today, we open a place where that same kindness and encouragement will be offered to thousands of young people in the years to come. Lewis invited Mr. Wallace to join him at the podium. The crowd applauded warmly as the elderly man moved forward with dignity. Many knew his story now, the mechanic who became a janitor to support his family, who quietly encouraged a young Lewis Hamilton, and who continued working well past retirement age to help his grandchildren after losing his son. "I'm not one for speeches," Mr. Wallace began, his voice soft but steady. "I spent most of my life in the background, fixing things, cleaning up, helping where I could. That's all I ever tried to do." He looked out at the assembled crowd. "But sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impacts. When I encouraged a young boy with racing dreams, I never imagined he would become one of the greatest drivers in history. When I stayed late to help him with his homework, I never thought he would one day create all this." Mr. Wallace gestured to the academy behind him. "This place isn't really about me. It's about possibility. It's about seeing potential in young people who might be struggling. It's about giving them the tools, skills, and most importantly, the belief that they can succeed." Lewis handed Mr. Wallace a large pair of ceremonial scissors. Together, they cut the ribbon stretched across the academy entrance. Cheers erupted as the doors officially opened to its first class of students. As people filed into the building for tours, Lewis and Mr. Wallace walked together through the main workshop. State-of-the-art equipment filled the space, alongside carefully restored vintage tools. The walls featured photos of racing history, with special prominence given to mechanics and engineers, rather than just drivers. They stopped at a special display case near the center of the room. Inside sat Mr. Wallace's old toolbox from the 1960s, carefully restored to its original condition. Next to it was a small plaque that read, "Dreams never die. They just sometimes need a little help to find their way back." "Do you like it?" Lewis asked. Mr. Wallace nodded, too emotional to speak for a moment. "It's perfect," he finally managed. As they continued their tour, students and visitors sought autographs from Lewis. But many also approached Mr. Wallace, asking for his signature alongside the champions, equal partners in this new venture. They ended their walk in a classroom where the first students were already exploring training modules on hybrid engine technology. The diverse group of teenagers included boys and girls from various backgrounds, several with visible disabilities. "You saved my dream," Lewis said quietly to Mr. Wallace, watching the students. "Now, it's time to help save a few more." Mr. Wallace smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That was always the plan." "What do you mean?" Lewis asked, confused. The old janitor's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Why do you think I stayed working at that school all these years, despite the pain and difficulty? It wasn't just for the money." "What was it then?" Mr. Wallace's voice grew soft, almost wistful. "I was looking for another Lewis Hamilton, another child with extraordinary potential who might need someone to believe in them. Lewis felt his throat tighten with emotion. And did you find one? Mr. Wallace's gaze shifted across the room to where Emma was explaining something about aerodynamics to a group of impressed adults, her hands moving animatedly as she described airflow patterns. Maybe, he said, a knowing smile playing on his lips. But that's a story for another day. As the afternoon continued, visitors explored every corner of the new academy. In the administration office, Sarah showed off the framed newspaper article about her brother James, placed prominently beside a photo of the newly renovated auto shop bearing his name. The business was already booked solid for months, staffed by experienced mechanics who were also qualified as instructors. Later, as the official ceremonies concluded, Lewis found himself alone with Mr. Wallace in the Academy's small library, filled with books on automotive engineering, business management, and racing history. A special section contained materials specifically designed for students with dyslexia and other learning differences. "Thank you," Lewis said simply, "for everything, back then and now." Mr. Wallace shook his head. "No, thank you, for remembering an old man who thought he'd been forgotten." "I should have come back sooner," Lewis admitted. "You came back exactly when you were meant to," Mr. Wallace replied, with the wisdom of his years. "Not a moment too late." Outside, the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the academy grounds. Students and visitors were reluctantly departing, many planning to return for the first official classes the following week. As Lewis and Mr. Wallace walked out together, they passed a young girl studying an engine diagram on a display screen. She had the same focused expression, the same intensity that Lewis had shown as a child. Mr. Wallace nodded toward her, smiling slightly. Lewis understood. The circle was complete, and a new one was beginning. Some dreams take a lifetime to fulfill. Some promises take decades to keep. But when they finally come true, they can change not just one life, but countless others along the way. In the fading light, 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton and 81-year-old former janitor George Wallace stood side by side, equals in the most important race of all, the race to make a difference in the world they would someday leave behind. Thanks for joining me till the end. Let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love Lewis Hamilton. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this heartwarming story of friendship and second chances. See you in the next one.